أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين.
Amin Amin Ya Rabbal Alamin. Thank you for joining us. Now, let me briefly outline our agenda for today. We will begin with the recitation of Surah Al-Fatiha, which we have just completed. I will provide some guidelines and information to ensure a smooth session. Feel free to send your questions in the chat throughout the presentation. We will listen to a lecture by our esteemed speaker, Sister Sayema Zulfeqar, followed by a question and answer session. Lastly, we will close the session with feedback forms and a closing dua. To ensure a smooth and productive session, please follow these guidelines. If possible, please keep your cameras on to create a more engaging and interactive environment. We also recommend switching to gallery view to see all participants and feel more connected. Please refrain from recording the session or taking screenshots to keep our content secure and private. Inshallah, the recording will be uploaded and shared on the ISIP YouTube channel. To minimize background noise, kindly keep your microphone on mute when not speaking. For clarity, please rename yourself in Zoom to include your name and country. This helps us address you appropriately and understand the diverse backgrounds of our attendees. If you have any questions, please use the chat option to submit them. We will address these questions during the designated question and answer session. If you need live transcription, click on the More option and select Request Live Transcription to enable subtitles for the session. A little bit about ISIP, the International Students of Islamic Psychology. ISIP is an inclusive space designed to connect people with diverse backgrounds interested in Islamic psychology. Our goal is to disseminate knowledge, share resources, and discuss best practices in a free and accessible manner. We support the personal and professional development of those passionate about Islamic psychology. Whether you are pursuing studies, advancing your career, or deepening your understanding within your community or country, we provide the resources and opportunities you need. Here are some ways to stay connected and engage with our community. Join our WhatsApp group for ongoing discussions and quick updates. Visit our website at www.isipfoundation to become a member and access our extensive digital library with valuable resources on Islamic psychology. Subscribe to our YouTube channel for the latest content, including lectures and workshops. And follow us also on Instagram at ISIP_global for updates and highlights. You can also scan the QR code for our Islamic Psychology group, which you can find here. Feel free to use it if you find it beneficial. So it is my pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker for today's session, Sister Sayema Zulfeqar. Sister Sayema is a counselor and director of Afiyah, Counsel and Care, currently based in Metro Vancouver. She holds dual bachelor's degrees and a master's degree in psychology, and she recently graduated with a postgraduate diploma in Islamic psychology from the Cambridge Muslim College. She has authored numerous articles on Muslim mental health and has written an award-winning paper on psychological resilience in Islamic context. Today, Sister Sayema will share her insights on how Islamic psychology can be used to cope with anxiety stemming from family and cultural trauma. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Sister Sayema Zulfeqar. Without further ado, Sister Sayema, the floor is yours. It is an honor to have you with us.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Jazakallah khairan kathira for the beautiful warm introduction. Really appreciate it. And thank you so much for having me here today. It's an absolute honor, inshallah. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept your efforts and put barakah in this initiative. Ameen. So with that, Bismillah, Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wahlul 'uqdatam min lisani yafqahu qawli, Rabbi zidni ilma. So, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu, everyone. I hope and pray, inshallah, you're all doing well, and inshallah, you're all flourishing in the best state of iman and health, bi'idhnillah. And my name is Sayema Zulfeqar. Inshallah, in today's session, I'm currently based in Vancouver, so it's early morning. So in today's session, inshallah, we will be looking at how you can cope with anxiety from an Islamic psychological perspective that's often a result of cultural and familial trauma. So inshallah, I'm pulling up my slides here. Just a moment. Right, I hope inshallah you can all see my screen. Bismillah. Right, so Bismillah, let's begin by defining what anxiety is in the first place. We often talk a lot about anxiety, depression, but sometimes we're completely unaware of what that emotion or that feeling is. So, anxiety, according to the American Psychological Association, is an emotion that's characterized by feelings of tension, worried thoughts, and physical changes like increased blood pressure. So, in a nutshell, anxiety is an excessive fear, an excessive worry about something that is to come. And this excessive worry impacts your bodily state. So it induces a lot of bodily reactions, such as difficulty breathing, perhaps palpitations, increased blood pressure, headaches, and so on. So interestingly, it is an emotion that not just impacts your cognitive ability, but also impacts your behavioral response. And oftentimes, there are many different ways people describe anxiety. And sometimes there are many different emotions that people actually use to describe anxiety, and that's not really exactly anxiety in the first place. So let's look at how sometimes people describe anxiety as. So some people might call anxiety as a state of sadness. Some people might mislabel it as a stress. Some people might mislabel it as a fear of something, where some other people might think it's just confusion. So there are many different emotions that are oftentimes confused with anxiety. But as we will look at, inshallah, in today's session, anxiety is a completely different emotional reaction, and how it differs from fear, stress, sadness, and confusion. We'll just take a look at that in a minute, inshallah. So there are three things to keep in mind when we are talking about anxiety. The first characteristic of anxiety is that it is, like we talked about, it is an excessive worry, an excessive fear, right? And that fear or worry is actually a result of perceived threat. So something that you perceive as stressful, as dangerous, can induce anxiety. So, for example, you might perceive a cat as dangerous, when in reality, that cat is completely harmless, right? So, seeing that cat or encountering that cat on your path may induce feelings of anxiety. Some people, for example, are anxious about flying, right? So, even though flying is completely 100% safe, they perceive flying as dangerous. And so that might again induce feelings of anxiety. Sometimes anxiety is also rooted in anticipation of the future. So, unlike fear, fear is a reaction, a response to a stimulus that is already present, right? So, for example, you might be fearful of spiders, you might be fearful of snakes when they're already present. But unlike fear, anxiety is about anticipation of what is to come. So the perceived threat may not even be present in the first place. So, for example, before you start your flight, let's say you have fear of flying, you keep anticipating. You keep anticipating the worst possible scenarios in your mind, and as a result, you continue inducing feelings of anxiety. So it's more future oriented as opposed to present. And another characteristic of anxiety that we often notice is a sense of lack of control. So, a lot of times, people who are experiencing this feeling of anxiety often describe it as as a sensation where they feel they don't have control of their life or the situation at hand, right? So going back to the example of maybe fear of flying, right? A lot of times this fear is actually a result of the loss of control, because you don't know what's happening, you can't really see where you're moving, and you can't really tangibly see what is coming, right? You feel a loss of control in your life, and so that again induces a lot of anxiety in people. So 3 things during trauma: keep in mind how fear and anxiety are different. Anxiety is a result of, like we talked about, perceived stress. It is anticipation of what's to come, and a feeling of lack of control of the particular situation at hand. Coming to anxiety and trauma, so there are numerous studies that indicate that there is a relationship between anxiety and childhood or familial trauma that you may have experienced. And it's demonstrated, subhanAllah, in a lot of ways. But when you've been through something traumatic in your life, maybe you've lost a loved one, maybe you've been through a life-saving, a life-threatening accident. Maybe you've been through something terrible at school. When you've been through something traumatic, in a nutshell, apprehension about that episode or re-experiencing a similar episode can also induce feelings of anxiety, right? So for example, if as a child you were probably beaten up or bullied for something, let's say you were bullied for how you spoke, right? And this can actually induce feelings of anxiety, where in turn you start becoming anxious of any public speaking opportunities. So what you've been through in the past as a child can impact your present even as an adult, subhanAllah. And we particularly see this in the context of emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, and emotional and physical neglect. So these are actually considered to be risk factors for developing anxiety later in your life. So if you've been emotionally abused by people around, maybe physically abused, maybe sexually abused as a child, maybe even neglected physically or emotionally by your primary caregivers, you are at a greater risk of developing anxiety later in your life. And oftentimes, this anxiety is manifested in a lot of ways. So as a child, you may have experienced, like we talked about, something traumatic, maybe emotionally, physically, or sexually. And that induces a lot of anxiety, which is bottled up. And that anxiety is manifested through a lot of symptoms that you may not even realize are actually signs of anxiety. So, for example, as you grow up, you may notice you have difficulty breathing. Maybe you have trouble sleeping, trouble concentrating at work or studies, or maybe sometimes trouble concentrating in salah. You might notice you have headaches, or maybe some chronic pain. You have digestive issues, and you feel restless and irritable for things that you shouldn't be feeling irritable about. And most importantly, you have intrusive memories of your past traumatic experiences, right? So all of these are symptoms and characteristics of anxiety, which subhanAllah, people often overlook. And a lot of these symptoms are actually misunderstood to be signs or maybe symptoms of a physiological disease. So a lot of people who are, subhanAllah, diagnosed with anxiety later in life have been to multiple doctors, multiple physicians, have gotten many tests, because they assume that all of these symptoms may be an underlying maybe resulting from an underlying physiological disease. But in reality, this is a manifestation of a hidden trauma experience that's inducing these feelings of anxiety and these symptoms of anxiety in your life. So now that we talked about this relationship between trauma and anxiety and how trauma can manifest as anxiety in our lives, so how do we cope with anxiety as adults from an Islamic psychological perspectives? So there are two ways to cope with anxiety. One is through self-care measures that inshallah we will be looking at now. And the second being, of course, seeking professional help. So how do we cope with anxiety by ourselves? The first suggestion that I have for you brothers and sisters here today is start by making peace with the decree of Allah and reassuring yourself that pain is purposeful in our lives, right? A lot of times when we've been through something traumatic as a child, maybe we've been abused, we've been neglected, mistreated, right? It's hard to make peace with the traumatic experience that we've been through, right? But reminding yourself again that the pain that you've experienced was purposeful, was decreed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for a reason, really reassures your heart and helps you redefine the trauma that you've experienced. As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, in Surah Al-Baqarah, وَلَنَبْلُوَنَّكُمْ بِشَيْءٍ مِّنَ الْخَوْفِ وَالْجُوعِ. We will surely test you with something of fear and hunger and a loss of wealth and lives and fruits, but give good tidings to the patient. So being tested is a part of life. Facing hardships and obstacles is a journey of life. And even the best and the greatest of people, like the Prophet ﷺ, was tested too, right? So viewing hardships, viewing trauma as an opportunity to grow closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and re-strengthening your relationship with Allah is how we should be redefining trauma. Next is while you're trying to make peace with the decree of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and accepting that whatever happened, whatever painful episode that happened in your life was purposeful, and there is something to learn from, the next step is to define your locus of control. Like we talked about, anxiety is rooted in a sense of lack of control in our lives, right? We feel like we don't have control over this situation. And so you start having these excessive worries because you don't have control over it, right? So when you're experiencing anxiety, take a step back and ask yourself, what can I do in this moment? What can I influence in this moment? And what does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala control in my life right now? Right? So taking ownership of your healing is the second step for coping with anxiety. Yes, trauma has happened. Yes, yes, I will be tested. Yes, I will face hardships in my life, but I need to take a step up and take ownership of my own healing by the permission of Allah, right? So this is an interesting diagram that inshallah you can hopefully benefit from. Is sit down and maybe write down what can you control about your situation right now. What are some of the things that you can do to maybe improve yourself, to maybe make this phase easy for yourself? What can you influence, right? Maybe who can you reach out to for support? Maybe your loved ones, your friends, any professional help, right? And what does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala control in your life? And it's interesting to see how all of these are, subhanAllah, enclosed within Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's control, right? So assuring yourself that everything is happening by the decree of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and it's all within the realm of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, within His control, and whatever He decrees is for our own betterment, inshallah, really helps to ground ourselves and cope with anxiety from an Islamic perspective. Moving on to some of the behavioral strategies that you can implement in your daily life in terms of coping with anxiety is something we call grounding technique. And one of the most popular grounding techniques that we have is deep breathing exercises. So if you're someone who's routinely struggling with anxiety, struggling with difficulty breathing, palpitations, feeling stressed all the time, take some time every day, maybe in the early hours of Fajr, and do a lot of deep breathing exercises. Ideally, do this outdoors, but if you can't go out, maybe sit down in a comfortable room, on a comfortable chair, at a comfortable position, and inhale for 4 seconds, hold your breath for 4 seconds, exhale for 4 seconds, and hold your breath again for 4 seconds, and then continue. So this is what we call in psychology box breathing, and it really, really helps you de-stress and unwind from all that you're holding in your heart. So something you can definitely incorporate, a simple exercise that you can definitely incorporate in your daily life. And you can even incorporate this along with your morning walks or evening walks every day if you go out. So taking a step back, doing a lot of deep breathing exercises, renewing your intentions really helps you, inshallah, stay grounded. The next suggestion that I have for you, brothers and sisters, is finding time to reconnect with nature. SubhanAllah, we're so disconnected. We're so disconnected from our own bodies, from the world around us, from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, from the universe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created, that we struggle to be mindful and present in our lives, right? So taking a step back and spending time outdoors, reconnecting with the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is one of the most powerful ways of coping with anxiety. And there are numerous studies to actually show how spending time in nature, maybe going out on a walk, maybe watching sunsets, sunrises, helps you cope and overcome many big feelings like anxiety. And in fact, there are even studies to indicate that it also helps to cope with depression. So this reminds me of the verse where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, and He is the one who spread out the earth and placed firm mountains and rivers upon it, and created fruits of every kind in pairs. He covers the day with night. Surely in this are signs for those who reflect. And subhanAllah, this is a beautiful, beautiful sign of Allah, right? Being outdoors, spending time in the wilderness is a sign to reflect of Allah's existence. So you may a lot of times I see many clients who tell me, oh, I live in New York City, I live in Saudi Arabia, there's not a lot of nature, there's not a lot of landscape. And my only suggestion in that case to you would be at least take a walk outside to your local park every day, maybe 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 30 minutes, whatever works for you. Start small, take your baby steps, but be consistent in the process. There are also other prophetic supplications that the Prophet ﷺ particularly prescribed in terms of dealing with excessive worry. So one of the du'as the Prophet ﷺ would frequently make is this one, where he said, اللهم إني أعوذ بك من الهم والحزن والعجز والكسل والبخل والجبن وغلبة الدين الرجال. O Allah, I seek refuge with you from worry, grief, incapacity, laziness, miserliness, cowardice, and being overpowered by other men. And this is a beautiful dua that you can include in your daily morning and evening adhkars, brothers and sisters. A beautiful dua that you can memorize, maybe teach your children, teach your spouses, and make it a part of your everyday dua routine, inshallah. And there's another supplication that the Prophet ﷺ would particularly recite, and this is Allahumma la sahla illa ma ja'altahu sahla وأنت تجعل الحزن إذا شئت سهلا. Oh Allah, there is no ease other than what you make easy. If you please, you ease sorrow. So again, another beautiful dua that you can incorporate in your daily life. And dua is definitely the best measure that a believer has, and the best protection that a believer has, inshallah. And finally, so if you've tried all of these self-care measures, if you've tried deep breathing exercises, maybe tried going out, tried a lot of things, and if it doesn't help, I would definitely suggest that you seek professional help for coping with anxiety. And some of the types of therapies that can work really well, particularly for anxiety, is exposure therapy. That's a part of CBT. Psychodynamic therapy that can, inshallah, help you address any unaddressed feelings, unaddressed emotional baggage that may be a result of trauma. And sometimes, depending on depending on how you cope with anxiety, your therapist might even refer you to a psychiatrist, and you may be prescribed a few medications. So I would suggest going to someone, seeking help from someone who is culturally competent, and who is providing services from a faith-based perspective. Seeing a therapist who is probably a Muslim, has a good understanding of your culture, and who probably uses an Islamic psychological paradigm would be a great fit. And inshallah, seeking professional help promptly can help you address your anxiety effectively and cope with it, and help you, inshallah, come to terms with all the baggage that you may be holding on from your cultural or familial trauma. So with that, Jazakumullahu khairan kathira, brothers and sisters. Inshallah, if you have any questions, particularly in relation to trauma, anxiety, inshallah, this will be a good time to ask. Jazakumullahu khairan kathira.
Thank you, Sister Sayema, for the comprehensive presentation. We now have some time for questions. If you have any questions for our speaker, please type them into the chat box and we will address them one by one, inshallah. Sister Kuja, can you help me please to read the question?
Yeah, Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Excellent presentation, mashallah. Allah Mubarak. Quite a lot to take with us. I'll keep an eye on the chat box. Sisters, feel free to send your questions, inshallah. Okay, I'll get that started with this first question. Majority of us think that seeking help from counselors or therapists is a lack of iman. How would you address that, please?
Okay, so that's a really good question, and something that I get a lot, particularly from Muslims in our community. So a lot of times, subhanAllah, we assume that mental distress, whether it's in terms of anxiety, whether it's depression, OCD, or any other manifestation, is a result of lack of iman. But that's not entirely true, because the Prophet ﷺ said that a believer will be tested, right? A believer will be tested in a lot of ways. And if we look at the life of the Prophet ﷺ, subhanAllah, he was tested with grief. He was tested with loss. He was tested with a lot of things. And even if we look at the lives of other prophets, Prophet Yaqub alayhi salam was tested with separation. Prophet Ayyub alayhi salam was tested with diseases and again separation, right? So presence of a mental distress is not really a sign of lack of iman, but it can be your faith can be an accelerator for facilitating your healing, right? So your relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, your relationship with the Quran, your iman can actually be an immune system to facilitate healing against mental distress. So like we talked about, there are many supplications in the Quran and the Sunnah for certain situations. There are many strategies the Prophet ﷺ himself employed that can help us in our daily life, right? So experiencing any distress is not a result of lack of iman. There are many reasons for psychological distress. Sometimes it can be due to biological reasons, due to environmental factors, just like we don't associate physiological diseases to a result of lack of iman, right? Likewise, we understand mental illnesses and distresses as maybe a test from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, a test of our faith, and a test of, inshallah, building greater resilience.
Jazakallah khairan. Very well addressed. Alhamdulillah. Sisters, feel free to unmute your mic and ask your question, inshallah.
Hello, assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
So basically my question is that in cases of psychiatric issues, so we should, so like we have two choices of treatment, either Ruqayya or either like general tradition, conventional medical treatment. So are there separate indication to divide them, whether we have to do Ruqayya or conventional medicinal treatment, and how to combine with them both, and how like to tackle the psychiatric issues?
That's a very good question. So yes, Ruqya is often a part of Islamic psychological interventions that Muslim psychologists use. So what I would suggest is if you're seeking therapy from an Islamic counselor or a Muslim psychologist, if they feel the need, oftentimes they will refer you to a local Raqi for treatment with the Ruqya, and this treatment with the Ruqya can actually be complementary with your treatment in therapy or with medications as well. So a lot of times we use a lot of different strategies, a lot of different interventions at once. So you may be doing Ruqya, you will also probably be seeking therapy alongside, you may be even seeking medications, depending on the severity of your anxiety and distress. So I would suggest you reaching out to a Muslim or an Islamic counselor.
Okay,
Yeah.
Okay, in absence of any like counselor who is aware about like these things, what an individual, from the individual perspective, which one they have to prefer, like that, like are there any separate indications like for this disorder we do this, like that? Are there any separate clear-cut indications or something like that?
So it's not that easy in terms of identifying what. Yes, so I get your question. So coming to answer your question, it's not really easy to identify whether your distress is a result of a spiritual crisis or it is due to an actual mental crisis. So this is why you might need to consult a professional to be able to identify and pinpoint and separate where it's coming from. There are no individual factors, but if what I would suggest is if you're able to do Ruqya on your own and you're able to see a difference and you're able to benefit, well and good. But if you think that it's not, that's not helping you, then you might need to see someone. Yeah.
Okay. Jazakallah khairan.
Yeah,
This is just a comment as well. Somebody say, I love the reminders that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is in control and the divine degree, because this is the key factor in coping with anxiety. And in case of psychiatry issue, should we combine the treatment with Ruqya? I think you just addressed that question. Can I
Yes.
assume so? You just addressed it? All right, well
Yes.
done.
Yes.
Okay. And a sister has a question, how the previous prophet normalized feeling anxious and depressed. She said, I often hear many Muslims say you shouldn't believe in these symptoms because they are from Shaitan and show weak faith. I think you addressed that as well. Also, that going to someone to help in showing you is showing you do not believe that Allah will make things better for you. So I think that you addressed it very well. That was my question.
Yes. So, yeah, I think those have been addressed already. So I see a couple of questions more, inshallah, if you can, yeah.
Yeah, some quick question, how to deal with psycho-narcissistic husband. I think this might be related to marriage. What would you think? 24 years of abuse.
Subhanallah, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make it easy for you, or inshallah facilitate your path. I would suggest seeking professional help from a marital therapist and identifying how you can inshallah cope in this situation. And if there's any form of abuse, maybe physical or sexual abuse involved, I would encourage you to reach out to your local helpline for prompt assistance, inshallah.
What courses and books would you recommend to learn about this in more depth for self-application and working with clients?
So when it comes to trauma, I think one of the most useful resources that I've come across from an Islamic perspective is Dr. Umar Rida's work. So Dr. Umar Rida is, mashallah, a Harvard-trained trauma therapist. So inshallah, you can look out for his books. I'm not entirely sure, but he has two published books on trauma from an Islamic perspective. So you can take a look at that. And also, if you're looking for a secular perspective and not necessarily, an Islamic perspective, there's a book called The Body Keeps the Score. It's an excellent book, a must read in terms of understanding how trauma manifests in your body. And there's also another great book by Dr. Gabor Mate, When the Body Says No. So these are great resources to begin with, inshallah.
Sorry, I was muted.
No worries.
Okay. Right. Jazakallah khair again for addressing that question very well.
There is a question asking about if it's okay to talk about people. The question is, can you please talk about if it is okay to speak about others in your therapy session? Will it be considered ghiba?
That's a very good question. So no, it will not be considered ghiba because in fiqh, scholars have certain criteria, certain conditions when you're allowed to speak about someone. And one of those situations is when you are seeking professional help from a therapist or a counselor. And in those circumstances, it is permissible for you to talk about what someone did or how what someone did impacted your present mental state. In those situations, it is inshallah allowed to do so.
Okay, wonderful. That's actually a very, very good question. There's another interesting question here. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for the wonderful talk. I have a question regarding balancing and managing my emotions. I tend to spend my days as energetic and bright as I can, but I always end up keeping on looking back on those good days. Then when I suddenly feel both mentally and physically exhausted, quite frequently nowadays, I was unable to rest though. I know I really need one and end up doing something, neglecting my feeling. Is there any advice for my case?
Jazakallah khairan kathira for the question. Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. So something that I can suggest, inshallah, particularly in relation to your concern is identifying your emotion. So giving your emotion a name. What is it exactly that you're currently experiencing? And one of the ways to do that is to actually check in with your emotions. So there are many apps, many emotional check-in apps that inshallah you can take a look at. And I think one of those, I can't really remember, but inshallah I will share the name of the app here inshallah. I think it's called How We Feel. You can download that on your phone. And basically what it does, it gives you a prompt twice a day, once in the morning, once in the evening, and asks you to assess what emotion it is that you're currently experiencing and why are you experiencing it. So it gives you a list of options to choose from, a list of emotions to choose from, and it asks you why you're feeling a certain way. So introspecting on what your emotion is, why you're feeling it is the first step. And secondly is going back to the circle of control that we talked about, right? So maybe take an opportunity to sit down and reflect. What can you do in the moment to improve your emotional state, right? So maybe doing things that you like, that help you feel relaxed, that maybe help you feel calm and induce a sense of happiness. So for example, maybe going out on a walk, baking something that you like, speaking to loved ones, spending quality time, right? So make sure you're dedicating at least a few minutes every day just for yourself, just for your own improvement, inshallah. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ease your affairs and keep you under his protection and mercy always.
Ameen. Ameen. There is another question. How can we differentiate if our anxiety is from shaitan or trauma? Or not from shaitan? Is there a way to differentiate that? That's a very good question.
Yes, that's a very good question. And oftentimes there's not really quite a simple answer to that. Because sometimes what really happens is, yes, it is true that shaitan induces a lot of fear, a lot of anxiety within us, right? A lot of irrational fears within us. And sometimes these fears may be actually stemming within our own nafs as a result of previous life experiences, right? So what I would suggest is to use a holistic approach when working with anxiety. So there's no one size that fits all, right? So sometimes you may benefit from professional help. Sometimes you may not benefit from professional help. So try and use a lot of different strategies to help you cope with anxiety. So for example, while you're incorporating self-care measures and maybe seeking professional help, do a lot of istighfar, do a lot of isti'adha, as the Prophet ﷺ taught us, right? Seeking refuge in Allah from the shaitan, maybe incorporating ruqya, maybe incorporating reflection on the Quran, right? So there are many different strategies that you combine holistically to deal with anxiety, because it's very hard to pinpoint, it's very hard to identify the root cause of anxiety, whether it's stemming from a place of trauma or it's stemming from shaitan. Because again, what happens is sometimes even when it's stemming from a place of trauma, it gets magnified by shaitan, right? So trying a lot of different strategies, a lot of holistic strategies, inshallah, can help you cope well.
Jazakallah khair. Done for address this issue very, very well. To her hands up. So would you like to ask your question, please?
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for the session. It was really helpful, of course. And my question is that, for example, you're having, like, you're taking this professional help, like you mentioned, CBT, for example. And even though you're, taking the help and the sessions and stuff, so they teach you, right, the methods and the self-care techniques and everything. Now, for example, after you're having these sessions, even during that time duration, right? So you have, suppose, a heated situation, maybe, like, where you're developing the anxiety, where the past trauma is just hitting into your mind and stuff. So the problem is, in the moment, like, your mind does not remind you that, okay, this is overwhelming and this thing should be done for grounding. But whereas, like, the time when you're not in the moment of anxiety, that's when you're like, okay, these self-care steps will help to bring the, myself calm, or to do the grounding, like the breathing and the nature walk and everything which you said. So, like, all these things, like writing or journaling, whatever it is. But in that moment of heat, however it is, anxiety really doesn't let your mind think of, all these self-care habits. So what would you say on this to do in the moment? Jazakallah.
That's a very good question. So when it comes to anxiety, as you mentioned, it's very hard to logically fight your brain away from those irrational thoughts and fears. So what I would say is, in the moment when you're experiencing anxiety, the first step is to embrace it, is to allow yourself to feel it. Because when we start wanting to run away from it, when we start wanting to escape anxiety, escape those difficult feelings, it gets hard, very, very hard to cope with it in that case. So give yourself the space to acknowledge and accept that, okay, I'm feeling anxious right now. It's okay. I'm worried about so and so happening. I'm worried about what is to come. Giving yourself that space, and then the next step would be to do something that helps you relax and de-escalate the sense of tension that you have, right? So once you accept anxiety, once you accept and name the feeling, the next step is to do something that helps you calm down. So it could be a breathing exercise, it could be a walk outside, journaling, and then sit down and reframe the situation at hand. So again, it takes a lot of consciousness, a lot of practice, and I definitely know that it's not easy, but inshallah, with time and with a lot of practice, with a lot of du'as, with inshallah, with a lot of effort, you should be able to reach a point where you can manage it even in the heat of the moment, inshallah. But the first step, again, as always, is to allow yourself to feel what you're feeling in the moment, inshallah.
Jazakallah for that. It does make sense. Thank you.
Jazakallah khair. There is one good question here. How would you tell your 59-year-old mother that she's suffering from anxiety and she needs to seek professional help? And is it wrong for a daughter to address that to the mother while she's thinking that she there's nothing wrong with her, but her behavior always affecting you and your relationship with her? How would you address that, please?
That's a good question. So because unfortunately I'm not much aware of your family dynamics, what I would say is that it is very difficult to convince your loved ones, moreover any elderly loved ones, to seek professional help. I would say is for you to begin with is to maybe have more open conversations with her at a time, at a place when you both are relaxed. A lot of times the way we say things, the way maybe the place where we say it, the manner we say it really impacts the message we're conveying, right? So making sure you're saying, you're talking to her in the right place, right time, right situation, and maybe bringing up this conversation with a lot of hikmah. You might not want to maybe tell her that yes, she has to seek professional help, she has anxiety, she is impacting maybe those around her, but maybe try to have an honest conversation about something like, oh, I've been noticing that you've been irritable lately, how can I help you? What's happening? What's holding you back? Do you want to maybe speak to someone, right? That's one way to, inshallah, facilitate more open and transparent conversations. And secondly is to remember that you can't really force someone to therapy, because the very first condition of seeking therapy is that you are self-motivated to change, right? So make sure you give her the space and honor her space before you inshallah suggest her to seek professional help, and try to maybe do a lot of different things with her. So like we talked about, a lot of self-care measures that you can employ, right? Maybe try to spend more quality time with her, maybe try to connect with her over walks, over something that you both like to do, right? And give her the space, inshallah, to heal and make a decision, and ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make it easy for her, inshallah.
Inshallah. Okay. Thank you all for your thoughtful questions. To stay on time, I think that will be our last question. Okay, so thank
Yes,
you,
inshallah.
Sayema, for your insightful presentations. Your guidance on blending Islamic principles with psychological practices is truly enriching. A big thank you as well to everyone who participated in the question and answer session. We hope the answers provided have been helpful in addressing your concerns. Let's take a moment to recap some of the key takeaways from today's lecture on how to cope with anxiety due to family and cultural trauma under Islamic psychology interventions. Okay, Sister Sayema has discussed about anxiety definitions, characteristics, symptoms, and also risk factors of anxiety, and the importance of recognizing these roots to address them effectively. Sister Sayema also shared valuable insights into various Islamic psychological strategies, including making peace with the decree of Allah, defining our locus control, deep breathing, reconnecting with nature, prophetic supplications, and also by seeking professional help. So, as we come to the end of today's webinar, I would like to extend our sincere gratitude once again to Sister Sayema for generously sharing her valuable knowledge and experience with us. I also want to thank the entire task force and to each of you, dear brothers and sisters, for your time today. We hope you found the discussion informative and that the strategies shared will be beneficial in your journey toward managing anxiety related to family and cultural trauma. Please stay tuned to our upcoming webinars and events. Before we conclude, please take a moment to recite a closing dua together. This is a beautiful way to seek forgiveness, express our gratitude, and end our gathering on a note of peace and blessing. Subhana rabbika rabbil izzati amma yasifun wa salamun alal mursalin walhamdulillahi rabbil alamin. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdika asyhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilaik. A'udzu billahi minasyaitonir rajim. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Wa innal insana lafi khusr illa alladhina amanu wa amilus solihati wa tawassaw bil haqqi wa tawassaw bis sabr. Sadaqallahul azim. Last but not least, kindly take a moment to fill out the feedback forms, dear brothers and sisters, as your input is invaluable to us. Thank you for attending. And please forgive us for any shortcomings. And until next time, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Take care and thank you once again for joining us.
Alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Excellent. Jazakallah khair, and see you again soon. Next month, our webinar will be every single month, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam. Thank you, everyone.